Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Audrey Burton-Vethke, and I am the Myeloma Community Manager. The Myeloma Crowd has a new program called the Myeloma Community that we are introducing this year. There are different chapters and events that cover a wide variety of topics. You can join any chapter that's interesting to you. We have a fitness chapter, a nutrition and wellness chapter, the Selinexor chapter, just to name a few. And once you're signed up for that chapter, you will receive notifications whenever a new event is created so that you can register for that event. We are looking forward to an exciting year with this program. I would like to thank our sponsors. Let me just pull this up here. Bristol Myers Squibb, Amgen Oncology, and Karyopharm Therapeutics. I'd like to welcome you to this new Selinexor chapter. We created this chapter because Selinexor is a new drug in the myeloma arsenal, and both patients and providers are not very familiar with how to use it in the clinic. The group will provide support to patients and caregivers on Selinexor. While today's meeting is more of a presentation, future meetings will feel more like a casual conversation and will include several patient advocates, like Robert Cisneros, who you will meet today. They will help moderate a group discussion as we cover a wide breadth of Selinexor topics. For today's meeting, we have invited Dr. Jatin Shah, Chief Medical Officer of Karyopharm, to get us started with the recent approvals, and Jenny Ahlstrom, Myeloma Crowd founder, will lead him in the discussion with questions. In the last 30 minutes, we will open up the meeting to your questions, so please use the question and answer section below to pose your question. We also want to introduce Robert Cisneros. So Bob, if you want to turn on your camera. He is a panelist who is a myeloma patient with Selinexor experience, and he is also a myeloma coach. Robert will be joining us regularly for these meetings to help us moderate group discussions. Dr. Shah, welcome to the program, and let me introduce you by sharing your bio. Dr. Jatin Shah, MD, is the Chief Medical Officer and Executive Vice President of Development at Karyopharm Therapeutics and has been since July of 2019. His responsibilities include the development of study protocols and clinical development plans. He prepares the regulatory documents and provides scientific and clinical input to each of the studies. Prior to that, Dr. Shah acted as the Senior VP of Clinical Development and VP of Clinical Strategy at Karyopharm Therapeutics. He is the co-founder of the World Health Forum, World Myeloma Forum, that was launched in February of 2017. Before those accomplishments, Dr. Shah was the director of the Myeloma Clinical and Translational Research in the Department of Lymphoma Myeloma Division of Cancer Medicine at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center. At this time, I'd like to turn the time over to Dr. Shah and Jenny as we begin this presentation.
It's a real pleasure and honor to be here with you and your team and everybody else today. So thank you.
Well, we're excited. We know you have some slides, and you're welcome to take as much time as you want. I think it would be really helpful for patients to hear the background of Selinexor, the first approval, and then you had a pretty exciting approval in December, and I know some people may have missed it just because of the holidays and things like that with the timing, but it was a great approval. So I think patients should be aware of that. And you can kind of walk us through that, and then we'll go through some Q&A.
So if we go to the next slide, just as a quick introduction to myself, as she mentioned, so an oncologist by training, spent about 10 years at MD Anderson Cancer Center taking care of patients, doing lots of clinical research, and then joined Karyopharm about 3 years ago in this role of continuing to develop Selinexor and make it available for patients worldwide. So couple of things I just want to share right out of the gate, a couple of important kind of just contact information and places of resource. There's a couple of the websites with XPOVIO.com with information about XPOVIO. carryforward.com, which is a great patient resource. Now we can talk a little bit about that at the end as well as karyopharm.com. And then Christina Schultz is our Director of Patient Advocacy. So she coordinates all of our kind of patient advocacy efforts and a great resource. Myself. Next slide. And so I think this slide really kind of touches on all the key take points with XPOVIO. And 2020 is a fundamental shift in how we think about XPOVIO and what patients can experience with XPOVIO. And we've shifted from our initial approval, as Jenny mentioned, in 2019, with just XPOVIO and dexamethasone, given it twice weekly at a high dose, at 160 milligrams, to a fundamental shift to once weekly, down from twice weekly, and low dose compared to high dose, all in combination. And so we see here in the second bullet point that XPOVIO Veldex was approved in combination with Velcade, where the initial dosages were 160 milligrams. And now with XPOVIO Veldex, we give everything once a week. And it's 100 milligrams of XPOVIO, so almost half of the dose. And we have data now also in combination with pomalidomide as well as daratumumab, all given once weekly at even lower doses of 60 milligrams up to 100 milligrams. And these are both on the NCCN guidelines. And the NCCN guidelines are the National Comprehensive Cancer Networks. These are all the major comprehensive cancer centers across the US, review all the data, saying what are appropriate regimens to be considered in relapsed myeloma. These are commonly used regimens and guidelines across the US. And so both of those are on the NCCN guidelines now, as well as regimens to consider and options for patients. All again given once weekly with low dose. And we have some emerging data in combination with Kyprolis as well that's been presented at previous meetings. A couple of points I'll make here. I mean, I think that one of the biggest things folks worry about with XPOVIO, and appropriately so, was the side effect profile and the side effects patients will have. And all of the side effects that we know of are all dose and schedule dependent. That means the higher the dose and the twice weekly are associated with more side effects. When you come down on that dose and go to once weekly, those side effects will often be much lower. And when you go lower, those side effects can be managed and mitigated. So very, very different when you're talking about giving literally half to a third of the dose that we initially got approval from 2 years ago. And with that, I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind when we think about side effects with XPOVIO. One, that we have not seen any significant major organ toxicity. And that means we haven't seen cardiac failure, we haven't seen lung failure, we haven't seen renal failure or liver failure or liver issues. And we'll talk about the lower incidence of neuropathy as we move forward. And so I think when you think about those major things, we haven't seen that. We have seen side effects that are transient and reversible, and we'll talk about that are very specifically nausea, vomiting, fatigue, weight loss, and those can be managed with supportive care. The third point I'll make is around the supportive care, Jenny. I think it's key. We think about, this thing's a lot, there's a lot of side effects. It takes a lot of supportive care. And in fact, it only takes 2 antiemetics. What we ask for, the biggest side effect we have is nausea. Just get ahead of it. Take 2 medicines to control the nausea from the beginning, not chasing it. And this is important. We don't see any anti-infection prophylaxis. So there's no anything to prevent blood clots. There's no antibacterials or antivirals to prevent, or antifungals that you take every single day. So really, from a supportive care measure, there's nothing that you take continuously. It's only just controlling the nausea out of the gate. And if we can do that, I think patients will have a great experience and really get the most benefit out of XPOVIO. Obviously, education is key. Anytime you get into a new class of drugs, there's a new side effects. It just takes time to get used to it and figure out the right dosage schedule. It's not if you have another IMiD or another PI in the same class of drugs, we're aware of it, we can feel it out. Here, anytime there's a new class that works completely different, there's a little bit of a ramp up phase. And I think we've gone through that. We understand how to manage the side effects. And as patients and physicians get more confidence and experience with it, I think we'll see that. Again, as I mentioned, all the side effects are associated with dose, and so they can be managed with dose reductions, interruptions. So the first thing you don't want to do is bail and say, I'm having side effects. The first thing you want to do is, I'm having side effects. Let's cut down the dose from 100 down to 80, down to 60. And oftentimes that will absolutely help minimize those side effects very, very nicely with additional supportive care. And those are still very active. And I think that's a key point. And we're also launching, as I mentioned, this patient voice initiative where we're trying to make sure that patients are at the center of everything we do. And so your experience can inspire others. And this support group that we have here, Jenny, is critical to that, where patients get confidence speaking to each other. Because anytime we can provide education, you can empower patients, and you provide them hope. When you do those three things, I think that's golden. So we want to really kind of magnify that patient voice, both kind of inside Karyopharm as well as globally. So next slide. So if you don't mind, I'll spend a few minutes, Jenny, and I think for everybody here, just to review how Selinexor or XPOVIO works, because it is a new class, and then we'll get into a little bit about some of the kind of data we have around the combinations. This, I think, is extremely important because, when we think about immune therapy, we've all heard about immune therapy, it's activating your own immune system to kill the cancer cell, right? And that's the real power of immune therapy and why it's really taking off. This actually is very interesting because we're all born with tumor suppressor proteins, things called TSPs. And tumor suppressor proteins, we're all born with them, every one of us. And its job is to suppress tumors. So when that cell starts dividing and starts turning into a cancerous cell, starts turning into a tumor, these proteins recognize that and say, oh, wait a second, this looks like it's turning into a cancer cell. That tumor suppressor protein then activates and then kills that cell, so before it becomes into a cancer cell or before it proliferates. So its job is our natural defense mechanism against tumors. And that's what we have, these tumor suppressor proteins. Now, cancer cells will try and evade this. They want to bypass this. They want to get away from this. And so they'll overexpress this exportin or XPO1. And when you do that, you push all the tumor suppressor proteins away from the nucleus where they're supposed to do their job. They're auditing the DNA. And when you push them out into the cytoplasm, they're no longer work. And so now they've evaded the function of the tumor suppressor protein. They can go on and grow and proliferate on their own. So when you inhibit XPO1, and that's what Selinexor or XPOVIO does, it inhibits XPO1, this nuclear export. What you get is your normal tumor suppressor proteins come back into the nucleus next to the DNA. They can audit the cell, and then if it's a cancer cell, will lead to the death of that cancer cell. So really, in a very high level, we have tumor suppressor proteins, our normal cancer defense mechanism. Cancer cells will try and evade this, any cancer cell, and by inhibiting XPO1, restore the function of these tumor suppressor proteins and lead to cell death, and reactivate your own cancer defense mechanism. And that's at a very high level how that works, Jenny. If there's any questions on that, I'm happy to help kind of dive into it, but it's a very, very elegant way. It gets really down to the fundamentals of cancer biology. It's not a myeloma specific thing, it's really fundamental to cancer and how all cancers form. And that's why we see activity of this drug in lots of different types of cancers, including myeloma. And now we have an approval in lymphoma as well.
Yeah, that's exciting. Yeah,
go ahead.
let's save our questions for later, I think, and
Sure.
Just keep going.
Okay, perfect. Next slide. And so I think there's really a growing body of evidence. And coming out of ASH last year, we had the approval of XVD. When you look across a number of subsets, Jenny, we see activity. So, patients above the age of 65, the ones that are most frail, and need, often don't tolerate combination therapy well. We actually found the biggest benefit there with a progression-free survival of 21 months versus 12 months. And I think it really speaks to the tolerability, because that was a big question before is, can XPOVIO be tolerated? I heard about the side effects. This really highlights that with once weekly low-dose XPOVIO with once weekly Velcade, everything given once weekly. This is the first trial ever done with once weekly Velcade. This is, a very nice, well-tolerated regimen, and even our older patients tolerate this well and actually have the longest benefit. And it speaks to the tolerability and the efficacy. When we look at fit versus frail in the second bullet, again, similar benefit. Importantly, when you reactivate these tumor suppressor proteins, it gets to fundamentally this high-risk cytogenetics. This high-risk cytogenetics, when you have all those DNA mutations, that's when tumor suppressor proteins work the most. So they recognize that and say, wait a second, here are mutations that are happening. These are not appropriate. So actually, when you look at patients with high risk disease, the progression-free survival is 12.9 versus 8.6. And when you look particularly in deletion 17p, the hardest to treat high risk, we actually see a doubling of progression-free survival. That's quite potent there. So I think there's really a very nice place for patients for high-risk disease to potentially benefit from this. And then we also presented some data in patients, in the relapse setting, most patients will get Velcade or Revlimid in the front line. And so we showed that regardless if you had Velcade or Revlimid, people still benefit even if we're retreating them with Velcade, especially if they had a long treatment-free interval. If they got Velcade and then some long treatment-free interval and got other therapies or no therapy and then come on, they benefit from this actually just as well as anybody else. I think that this is helpful and new data to really kind of inform who benefits and how they benefit. Next slide. And there's also emerging data as well, Jenny, with SKD, with so other kind of combination therapies. So XPOVIO in combination with Kyprolis as well, all given once weekly. XPOVIO in combination with pomalidomide showed about a 60% response rate, which is actually very much similar to most other pomalidomide-based triplets. So that's very nice all-oral combination, especially in the COVID era. That can be very promising as an all-oral. It's just as good as any other POM-based triplet or in that same ballpark with this limited data that we have now, but it's on the NCCN guidelines. And then obviously there's some data with Revlimid that we presented, and so some emerging data there. Next slide. So I just want to close with really patient resources. And that's, I think, really important, Jenny, because this is what
right
important. So there's a number of these Karyopharm nurse liaisons, incredible group of nurses that actually all of them or majority of them, as you can see, have hematology oncology experience. They're all from treating myeloma patients or transplant patients for a long, long time. So incredibly good team of nurses there that can be very valuable. So this team is available to come speak, to come educate. And it's led by Tina Longoria. So Christina can coordinate with you or any of the folks that are on this nurse liaisons. All they do is focus on education and supportive care.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide. And this just gives you more information about that. They can help really in a lot of different ways, not just around XPOVIO, but also the biology of myeloma and understanding your lab values and basic questions that come up and other kind of considerations in relapsed myeloma. So really a great group of great resources for patients. Next slide.
Great.
And the last thing I just want to comment really quickly is this Carry Forward program. This, I think, is really a great way where it really takes a lot of the things off patients' plates in terms of making sure that they have insurance coverage or financial assistance. And there's nurses that staff Carry Forward as well. So if there's questions, these nurses can help with some of that as well. So there's lots of support and resources there, and really can take a lot of this off. We, I think, want to be extremely sensitive to that point. And so I think this is a great program. And any patient, regardless of where you're in the country, who prescribes it, where you get the XPOVIO from, can sign into this program and enjoy some of the resources there. I think that was it. This just kind of gives into more detail around that. You can see there's a dedicated nurse manager there that can help provide that and provide instructions and social support and non-clinical education. So a lot of support there that we see they can help with third-party support for transportation. So they can be really a single stop for getting a lot of support across a number of needs for our patients. And I think I'll stop there. This repeats some of the initial things we talked about, Jenny, and then happy to kind of dive more into it. Really, the big thing is it's fundamentally different than a year and a half ago to where we're at now. I think an important option for patients, new class of drugs, and we know that myeloma, the way we've gotten to where we're at right now, the new class of the drugs, hitting the myeloma different and hitting it early.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were a few points that I want to kind of stress that you talked about during your presentation. And one is just the side effect profile. So when you think about side effects in myeloma, we have, as patients, we have a lot of side effects we're worrying about, right? We're worrying about neuropathy, We're worrying about GI issues sometimes with Revlimid. We're worrying about all sorts of different things. And we haven't, I think in oncology in general, it's quite common to have these nausea kind of side effects, but it's just something that myeloma doctors haven't worked with yet. So it's just a matter of education, in my opinion, to educate both patients and the myeloma physicians and general oncologists who are treating so that everyone is on the same page about how to get treated. So what you're saying about empowering patients and empowering the doctors with education is critical. Um, so yeah, I liked what you said. You can reduce dose, and I think the once weekly is really an important concept that you're learning this through your clinical trials. I also wanted to make the point that when you talked about the other combinations, like now you're talking about selinexor, carfilzomib dex, and those kinds of things. There's a class of patients in myeloma who are refractory to Revlimid. So, what do you do once you are refractory to Revlimid? You may not have a lot of different treatment options. So, having this be used in different combinations, I think is giving us the ultimate flexibility as myeloma physicians and myeloma patients. It's like if one
Absolutely.
class of drug doesn't work for you anymore, well, you can try Pomalyst, yes. If that doesn't work for you anymore, maybe you can add selinexor, or you know what I mean? As a patient, so I just want you to talk about that a little bit more, I guess.
Absolutely. I think that's actually the biggest point, Jenny, is that we've had, historically, we had really just three classes of drugs with IMiDs, proteasome inhibitors, and then a CD38 now. And I think that we're combining all of them early on with like Revlimid and Velcade and with daratumumab. But then when you progress on that, there's now this fourth class of drugs in combination that you can get in early lines of therapy, not in fifth, sixth, seventh line. And so here's the key. We're all comfortable with two important things in myeloma. One is class switching, right? We've all been comfortable if you're progressing on a Revlimid-based regimen to switch to a PI-based regimen. And that's how we've always done it, is we kind of alternate and bring in a new class of drugs. So, and number two, we had limited options before. And so we would do a lot of retreatment, stick within the same class, and just retreat. We're away from that now. I think that, oops, do you still see me?
We can. Yeah, we can see you. You're a little darker, but that's okay.
Sorry, Jenny.
Oh, you're fine.
I think there's a couple of things there that says, hey, when you're progressing on Revlimid, then class switching to a proteasome inhibitor-based therapy is key. And then now you have options here because now people have had Velcade, they're comfortable with Velcade. So this is a great option with a PI-based regimen. And we're also separating that. So as opposed to giving Revlimid and Velcade together, how do I get the most out of Revlimid? How do I get the most out of Velcade? When I use both together, I'm done with both classes. So if people are getting a Rev-Dara or Pom-Dara and switching to an XPOVIO plus PI, then is a very nice way. And that's where it makes a lot of sense, in first and second relapse, essentially. If you're progressing on Rev-Dara or Pom-Dara, your next option should really be switching back to a PI. And here's a great PI-based regimen, especially if you've already seen Dara before, when more and more patients are seeing it in first and second line. So as soon as you progress off an IMiD Dara, then we bring two new class of drugs, hit them differently, I think is what will be really exciting for patients now. We're really leveraging everything we've done before, which is class switching, bringing new classes in. So it makes perfect sense after you've had something like an IMiD Dara to switch over to two new classes. That's where we think that they're the best benefit.
Right. And just to reiterate what you said earlier, so selinexor was first approved, but not until like multiple lines of therapy with dexamethasone, right? And this new approval is now, just will you repeat what the new approval is?
Absolutely.
It's for first relapse, right?
Absolutely. The first indication is actually after you've progressed on 5 drugs: Revlimid, pomalidomide, Velcade, Kyprolis, and daratumumab. So it was in that setting. Now, this is actually anybody with first relapse and beyond. So anybody essentially with relapsed myeloma, starting with first relapse. And this is now with once weekly, not twice weekly, and half the dose roughly versus compared to what we've done before. So that's the fundamental differences. And now you can use it starting in first relapse in combination at a low dose.
Can you also talk about, because I saw in some of the data that it talked about the lowered peripheral neuropathy. Do you want to talk about that when using it with Velcade? Because neuropathy is a big issue for myeloma patients, and it's not something you really want to develop and maintain, but you want to be able to use Velcade when you need it.
Absolutely. I think thanks for bringing that up. That's actually a really important point. And so when we went with this combination, we actually saw a lower incidence of neuropathy down from roughly 47% down to 32%. And I can get those exact numbers for you. But it did decrease that incidence of neuropathy that we did see for patients. That is huge because even when we combine with anytime we add a third drug into a regimen, you always see the side effects go up, including with Pomveldex or Pomderadex, other Velcade-based regimens. We don't think of pomalidomide or Dara causing neuropathy, but you still see, even in that setting with those drugs, for example, with Pomveldex, the incidence of neuropathy is going to be 47%, and with Dara is going to be 47%. And here it's down to 32%. So lower neuropathy and lower grade 1 and grade 3 and grade 4 neuropathy as well, which is really the significant neuropathy. And that's important, as you said, because patients are living longer. We're giving these drugs earlier, and I don't want my patients living for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years or 20 years with long-term neuropathy. So this is actually the first time ever with a once weekly combination, and first time that we've seen a lower neuropathy when we add a third drug in. And that I think is really important for patients in terms of long-term quality of life, even when they're done with this regimen and moved on.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because when a new drug is approved, you kind of go through this learning curve, and I think you've been through this learning curve now, where you're testing it with different combinations, you're testing it with different doses, you're testing it with once weekly versus twice weekly, and you're really learning over time, while giving the benefit to patients about how they can use this drug as an option. So I just think that's pretty normal. That's what I've seen in other drugs as well. And I wanted to ask, on the neuropathy, I know that selinexor has some kind of anti-inflammatory property to it. Do you want to talk about that? And in that context, because is that why it's working well with Velcade, or like what about it is working well?
Yeah, I mean, I think from an efficacy perspective, there's really very nice data for why it works very nicely with Velcade. From the side effect profile as well, I think that once we've seen this, that actually if you give lower doses of 2 drugs, the side effects all get better. So as opposed to getting the most out of 2 doses, if you actually give a lower dose of Velcade and a lower dose of selinexor, is why we actually have this very potent combination that's very active. And actually I can give you lower doses of both. That's the ideal setting where something works so well together, I can actually drop the doses, better efficacy and better tolerability. And to your point, there is some nice data that XPOVIO does decrease inflammatory kind of inflammation. And we have some kind of preclinical data supporting that where we can see reductions in various inflammatory cytokines. Is that exactly leading to decreased neuropathy? It's always difficult to say what part of it, but there is an anti-inflammatory component to XPOVIO that we see as well.
Okay. Well, I think we should bring Bob on because Bob is on selinexor, and we want to see you, Bob. As I would encourage you to think about your questions and put them in the Q&A because we'll be looking at those and going through those. And I'm not the only one with questions, but I do have more questions. Audrey, did you want to introduce Bob in any certain or specific way?
I actually was gonna have Bob do more of an introduction for himself
Okay.
in our next meeting when it's more of the support group. Bob and Christy are going to be leading our support groups as patient advocates, but I can give you a small introduction.
No, Bob, go ahead. Go ahead, Bob.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Shah, for coming on today. The more information is empowering, and I certainly appreciate it. Kind of a quick bio on me is I was diagnosed 5 years ago, and totally out of the blue. Had a very healthy lifestyle, and all of a sudden got whacked. I've gone through all the other prescribed drugs, and I started on Selinexor the week of Thanksgiving last year. I started with 100 milligrams with Velcade and Dex, and was having a hard time dealing with the side effects, and those being the fatigue and this weird feeling of being outside of myself, muddled thoughts, and I couldn't put two thoughts together. And so we reduced the dosage down to 80 milligrams, and I'm able to tolerate that much better. And I don't feel nearly as bad as I did when taking the 100 milligrams of the Velcade and Dex. So that's been really good for me as far as the dosage. I don't know how, one of the questions I had was, in the clinical trials, how long did this combination work? And as far as, and what's the lifespan of this drug or combination of drugs?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bob. And first of all, thanks for joining today, and I really appreciate that and appreciate you sharing your story. Again, I think that your experience is incredibly important to share with others. And I'm very happy for you that this combination worked or is continuing to work. I think you highlight a couple of really important points, that 80 milligram dose, you didn't abandon it. You went down to 80 milligrams and you feel better. And actually, when you look at the median dose, so the average dose that most patients are on in Boston is exactly where you're at, which is 80 milligrams. So many patients stay on 100, but about half of the patients ultimately will need a dose reduction down to 80, and some even down to 60, and that's okay. So I think kudos for not kind of giving up at 100 and saying, let's go down to 80 and see what happens, and that's a great experience. And I think it really speaks to the point that if you have side effects, going down in the dose is a very effective way to do it and not abandoning. So I think it really highlights what the median dose on Boston, and your experience highlights that. I think the second question that you asked, or the second thing I just want to comment is on, and you didn't have any nausea, vomiting, it was just kind of this confusion or kind of weird out of body feeling, but no other nausea or vomiting that you experienced.
No.
Great. I think that, the average time when you look at those patients, when you look at duration of therapy, so those patients who actually go into a response, their duration of therapy is about 20 months. So almost a year and a half for the average. And then we have many patients staying beyond that at 2 and 3 years as well, still on therapy on the Boston study. So I think when you look at those patients who respond, the duration of therapy is at least 20 months. It's a little bit early on overall survival. We know that there's a trend towards an improvement in survival, but it's still a little bit premature to comment on that yet.
Mm-hmm.
Then that leads me to my next question is, I know there's a lot of quad chemistries coming out.
Yep.
Are there any specific using the Selinexor?
Yeah, great question. So there are, the Spanish group right now is looking at Velcade, Dara, Dex with Selinexor. So that 4 with Selinexor, Velcade, just like you're on now with the addition of daratumumab. And then we just kicked off actually a study, and so almost any of the quadruplets that we're wanting to investigate are being investigated now. For example, the MMRF is doing a study with ixazomib, Pomdex, with Selinexor. So 4 all oral therapies. So Selinexor, ixazomib, Pomdex, all oral. So that trial is just kicking off now, and patients can enroll onto that study. There's a couple of other studies where we're looking at things like Palm Elo-Dex with Selinexor, Palm Dara-Dex with Selinexor. So a lot of these studies are just starting now. Palm Veldex, basically a lot of these combinations with daratumumab or triplets we're investigating as we speak, all early in phase 1 and phase 2 trials. But the Spanish group with Velcade Dara is probably the farthest along, I would say. We haven't published any of that data yet, Bob, so it's hard for me to comment specifically on any of that data quite yet. But we are looking at all those.
Those are great questions, Bob, and thanks for your answers, Dr. Shah. I want to jump to some of the Q&A questions, if that's okay for a minute. First question is, can Selinexor shrink plasmacytomas? And then Cindy asked also, you know, this is kind of related to her question, any data on Selinexor and extramedullary myeloma?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things you have to remember is that XPOVIO or Selinexor is a small molecule, which means it can penetrate into these large tumors. And we have seen responses with extramedullary disease and plasmacytomas. We've seen that in the STORM data when we just looked at Selinexor and dexamethasone. And there are other kind of anecdotal case reports of patients responding with extramedullary disease. So we absolutely have seen that. We've published some of the data on that, patients with extramedullary disease.
And this is I just want to, for patients who are not familiar with that, that's when the myeloma basically grows out of the bone marrow. Usually it will stay in the bone marrow, and it's considered to be kind of a more high risk feature if it does, because it means it's spreading to places it shouldn't be. So it's good to know that there's something that's effective for these patients. Elise has a good question. She's asking, how quickly does Selinexor work? Can you reach CR with Selinexor? And, you know, when I was going through the transplant process, I remember my doctor saying, sometimes patients who respond really quickly to medication actually relapse really quickly to medication. So sometimes the slower response and the more durable, and it just keeps dropping over time, ends up being, you know, better. But do you want to address that question?
Yeah, absolutely. So Selinexor does work very, very quickly. So in the STORM data, when we're doing that, when we're looking at free light chains on week 2, we saw many patients going into a VGPR or even a CR as early as week 2 and week 4 of therapy. So it can occur very, very quickly. The median time to response is about 1 month, 1.1 months with XPOVIO Veldex. So when you combine the triplet, within the first month, you should know if you're responding or not. And one thing I'll point on there, almost everybody had some sort of benefit. There's only one patient on Selinexor Velcade Dex on the Boston study that had progressive disease after 1 month. Everybody else had stable disease or a minimal response or the PR and better. So within the first month, almost everybody had some sort of stabilization. They were coming up and they had some stabilization of their disease or a trend down. And so you're going to notice that in the first month. And can you reach a CR with Selinexor? And the answer is absolutely. When we look on the Boston study, about 10%, 10.9% of patients achieved a CR. There's nearly 17%, 16.9% with a combination achieving a CR. When you look at VGPR levels, those are also higher. So it does drive depth of response. And even in our first experience with just Selinexor, for patients who had progressed on Velcade, Kyprolis, Revlimid, Palm, and Dara, there's actually several patients that went into an MRD negative condition. So even after you progress after everything, your disease is super refractory. We saw patients achieving MRD negativity, which is exactly what we saw when we had Dara, but given by itself. We saw several patients in their initial experience getting MRD negative. So we know that we can drive deep responses, including CRs and MRD negativity. Now that's a big area of focus now, is trying to understand more of that. But the answer to your question is yes.
And just so if patients aren't aware, so VGPR is very good partial response. So you start with kind of like the depth of response, a partial response, a very good partial response. CR is a complete response, and then they say stringent complete response, which is even deeper. And then you start going into that MRD negative territory or MRD positivity, where you're only seeing a few cells in thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of cells. But that's kind of the scale. So when people say CR, it means complete response.
I don't know if you want to hear from Bob just really fast because he just got back his results. I didn't know if Bob just wanted to quickly share those results.
Oh, I'd be
You
glad.
don't have to if you don't want to.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. My light chain count was 1,068, I believe it was, and 6 weeks later, it's down to 460. So it's about a 60% reduction in the light chain in the since Thanksgiving.
Wow,
So I've had a really good response.
Yeah, that's great.
Congratulations, very happy for you. What
Thank
did you
you.
have before, Bob? If you don't mind sharing the prior therapies,
I
or did you have a lot of things?
think I've tried them all. Every one you've mentioned today, I've been on.
Including Velcade or Kyprolis.
Yes, and
That's great.
thinking about when I was diagnosed, my light chain count was 23,000, and to get it down to under 1,000 is a great accomplishment. And my medical team, I give them all the credit for that.
Yep. Congratulations. Very happy to hear for that. So good. That's great.
Thank you.
Chrissy had a question. She's also a Selinexor patient, but her question was COVID related. So she wanted to know if we know you are in clinical trials with COVID, right? As for this drug?
Yeah, so actually this target actually does work in the setting of antiviral. We have antiviral data where this, because a lot of the viral proteins go through XPO1, and so we have nice antiviral data with HIV and influenza and as well as COVID and RSV. Sorry, I think that because a lot of our myeloma patients get RSV as well. We've seen some of that preclinically. We did a trial with COVID, and there's subsets of patients that benefited. And COVID is very heterogeneous. Some people respond right away and get better. Some people don't. And so what we've seen is that there's subsets of patients that benefit from COVID-19. The overall trial was negative, but there's subsets of patients that were benefiting. And so we're still exploring additional trials.
Okay, there's an important question. This is a really important question about being refractory to Velcade, especially if you're using Selinexor with Velcade. So if someone's refractory to Velcade, would it make sense to add Velcade to Selinexor, or do you want to try to do it in different combinations like the Kyprolis Dex or just Dex or, with something else?
So I think all of those are important options at the end of the day. We know that in our initial experience that Selinexor can overcome Velcade resistance and even Kyprolis resistance. And so those combinations can be, we have lots of, just like Bob, there's a number of patients that have combination that have progressed after Velcade or Kyprolis. So there's still a number of patients that will respond to that combination with either Velcade or Kyprolis in that setting, whatever your physician wants to use. And I would say, yes, it should be taken with dexamethasone. I think it always helps everything we do in myeloma. I know we all hate it, but a lower dose of dex will be important with Velcade. They can overcome resistance in that setting.
Okay, another question is, can Selinexor cross the blood-brain barrier? I know it's not very common for myeloma to spread to the brain, but it does happen. And what's the status for that?
Great question. And we can go through the rest of these questions quickly. I want to make sure we hit them all. So Selinexor does cross the blood-brain barrier. We know that. And when we looked in patients with, for example, GBM, brain cancer, we had patients going to a partial as well as a complete remission with very, very difficult brain cancer. We actually have an ongoing program specifically in GBM. There's a published case report of a patient with lymphoma on one of our trials that went to the brain, went into a complete remission, which is again very difficult to treat with CNS lymphoma. And so there's a number of programs now that we're going to be looking at with CNS lymphoma, CNS myeloma, with Selinexor in combination with Dex or pomalidomide. So it does cross the blood-brain barrier, and we have seen activity in other types of tumors as well as in myeloma.
Mm-hmm. William had a very practical question, like why not just start with a lower dose, you know?
Yeah, I love it. And I think that's perfectly fine. There are physicians who are very, very, conservative or just learning, patients that have a lot of side effects or are frail. It's perfectly fine in that setting to start with 60 milligrams, for example, and then go to 80 milligrams. I think when you're in that range of 60 to 100, that's really the sweet spot. So some patients stay at 100 and go down to 80 and stay there. If you want to start at a lower dose, and we absolutely have gotten to that point of starting at 60 milligrams for some patients and going up to 80. When we're combining with a lot of our triplets with like Palm Veldex, we're starting at 40 milligrams and then going to 60 milligrams. So I think that it's okay to start with a lower dose. Now, if you have crazy disease that's really a thing, maybe it's okay to start at 100 and go to 80. But you can see it's not that big of a range. I mean, you're going from 100 to 80 or from 60 to 80. So I think it's okay to start in that 60 to 80 range if you're very kind of scared and still figuring things out.
So Elise had a question about just symptoms. She started her first dose of Selinexor on Thursday and was sick for 2 days with flu-like symptoms. What do you anticipate, or what do patients see after their first dose?
Great question. And the biggest things that people feel out of the gate is going to be nausea and vomiting and then fatigue. Now, she has a little bit different things with flu-like symptoms, just kind of body aches. And I would really say that in that setting, sometimes you get used to it and there's a little bit of kind of adaptation to it. We'd love to hear Bob's thoughts on how he kind of acclimated over time. But the easiest thing is if this persists, go down on the dose to 80 milligrams. Because it's not so common to have kind of flu-like fevers and aches. It's more about nausea and vomiting, fatigue that we'll see, and kind of a change in the taste buds and some symptoms Bob describes. And so this is a little bit atypical. And I would just say, if you're having additional side effects like fevers, it may not be the Selinexor, it may just be something else if you're having true flu-like symptoms. But otherwise, I think that a dose reduction to 80 milligrams would be appropriate because we don't want this to be continued. You should be, like Bob is, well tolerable, cruising along at the dose. And many of our patients that are on 60 or 80 milligrams are not even taking any of these antiemetic. They're just having no side effects and traveling the world. So this really would require a dose reduction in my mind, saying if you're having very sick for 2 days, if it's nausea and vomiting, you could tweak it. But if there's flu-like symptoms, we just want to go down on the dose a little bit. And maybe make sure you take your steroids. That can help as well.
Interesting. Okay, so Anne-Marie is considering using Selinexor. So she has extramedullary plasmacytoma kind of myeloma. And she's kind of where Bob was at, with the Darzalex not working and other drugs not working together. Her doctor wants to put her on Implicity. And then if that doesn't work, then Selinexor. I don't know if Implicity is the strongest option,
Yeah, and I think that's where, there's a little bit of the art of the medicine. What I can say is that when you have a drug that works on its own, that's what you want to really focus on, especially with something a little bit more aggressive like extramedullary. So we know that Darzalex has activity on its own. And so the drugs that have activity, single agent activity, that this thing works. And so single agent Implicity or Implicity by itself, there's no response rate. It's only in combination, and it may not overcome pomalidomide or daratumumab resistance. So, I think that that we have activity with Selinexor, just like you have with Kyprolis and Palm and Dara, as well as XPOVIO now with Selinexor, were drugs that did not have single agent activity like Implicity or panobinostat or Doxil. Those are, I think, where physicians are using these active drugs earlier. So I think that we have data in the setting of plasmacytomas. And I think it's a very important option to consider, especially coming out of if you have mutated disease with high-risk mutations and extramedullary disease. I think it would be an important option to consider sooner than later.
Yeah, and Anne-Marie, I think it'd be really important for you to understand your genetics, the genetics of your disease. So make sure you have a FISH test at a minimum, so you know what you're dealing with. And it looks like you've been on lots of different, Kyprolis, Palm, Dara, lots of different drugs. So I agree that the single agent activity, Implicity doesn't work by itself. It only works when you combine it with Revlimid. So, yeah. Okay. So, and you can always reach out to me at jenny@healthtree.org if you want to follow up with any questions and things like that. I do have a genetics question though that I'd like to maybe end with, and then maybe Bob has a final question. What you said earlier in your presentation is really important because many myeloma patients, deletion 17 is like the worst thing to be dealing with when you have myeloma.
Yep.
And there haven't been, and many patients pick up this mutation over time. So, it's while your myeloma may not start out high risk, sometimes it evolves to be that way. And how and why, and in what other combinations? Like I know Velcade, bortezomib specifically, has been shown in other data to affect or to be good for deletion 17 patients too. So this Selinexor, bortezomib or Velcade kind of combination, is that why you think it's working for the deletion 17 patients? Can it be used earlier in high risk, newly diagnosed deletion 17 patients as an option? Let's just see, are you trying to look at those trials? That's really critical.
So 100% agree, Jenny. This is probably the hardest to treat myeloma.
Yeah.
Mechanistically, it makes sense, and it's not by happenstance. So we expect it to work in high-risk disease, and it did. It worked really beautifully in high-risk disease. We know Velcade is probably one of our better drugs in high-risk disease that we all feel comfortable with. So this is a very, very nice combination for patients with high-risk disease, period. And so this is something that probably warrants investigations and considerations in early setting for high-risk disease as soon as you have any implications of high-risk disease, including deletion 17p. We are looking in patients with newly diagnosed myeloma. So all those trials are just starting now for specifically newly diagnosed settings. So I would be remiss to really comment on newly diagnosed setting, but absolutely with this combination, introducing XPOVIO earlier for high-risk disease is going to be very important.
Mm-hmm. And Bob, did you have another question?
Just want to touch on, what is coming down the pipeline and what new drugs are being tested when Selinexor quits working and in combination with the other drugs. What other drugs are coming down the pike that we can look forward to being approved?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of agents. So there's melflufen, which hopefully will get approval later this year. And there's other BCMA targeted therapies that are also coming, as well as other targets in CAR T cell space. So I think that, research is ongoing. There are other ways of that are still in clinical trials that haven't been proven yet, but hopefully will be approved later this year. And so those will continue to add to the arm, including BCMA targeted therapies, and then melflufen may be another option. And there are others as well being developed.
William had a question for 1114 patients. Venetoclax is kind of the only genetic specific myeloma therapy.
Yeah.
Would you put XPOVIO in front of venetoclax if you were an 1114 patient?
No, I mean, there's very, very good data with venetoclax in 1114, and patients who have that should absolutely get venetoclax. One thing I will comment there, though, is that the protein that venetoclax stops is BCL2 and BCL6, right? So the BCL proteins. Those are oncoproteins. So these are proteins that drive cancer, okay? Now, the recipe to make that protein, the messenger RNAs, are actually carried by XPO1. And so before, it's been very, very difficult to target and inhibit BCL2. But there's very nice data that XPOVIO actually also inhibits the making of BCL2. So not after you make it and stop it, but actually even making the BCL2. And so this becomes a very nice way. So actually there's very nice preclinical data that combining Selinexor and venetoclax is very potent, and we have data preclinically with in other cancers. There's an ongoing clinical trial combining the two, including in AML and lymphoma and myeloma that we're going to be soon hoping to open up. But mechanistically, it makes sense because BCL2 is the driver of these diseases, and you can either stop making BCL2 or once it's made, inhibit, and it works very nicely together, at least preclinically. We'll look at that clinically There is some anecdotal data from people that I've talked with that when they combine with venetoclax, but I think that data has yet to be published. I would not put it in front of venetoclax for somebody with 11-14, but it's certainly an option to potentially explore afterwards. And I think more research needs to be done around that space. We can talk maybe offline about that. So.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Dr. Shah, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, I enjoyed your presentation, but I think just being able to answer patient questions is so, so important, because this is information that we don't know how to answer. So.
No, absolutely. There's a lot of research ongoing, and a lot of these, combinations are being explored. A lot of the questions you're asked, and so there's some data that's published and more data that's being generated around that. So, at the end of the day, the more we can educate and empower patients, I think that's the most.
Yeah, excellent. Well, we'll turn it back over to Audrey, and I just thank you as a patient for everything you're doing for my
Thank you, doctor.
Thank you, Bob, for joining too.
Thank you.
Thank you for everything you guys are doing.
Dr.
Really,
Shah.
this is the best we can do. Thanks, guys.
Great. We appreciate each of you and your desire to be here, your participation. I feel like this has been a very successful meeting. I've learned a lot. And again, thank you, Dr. Shah, for your time. Thank you, Bob, for being that patient advocate. And thank you, Jenny, for asking such great questions and helping that conversation happen. As we finish up here, we would like to thank our sponsors one more time: Bristol Myers Squibb, Karyopharm Therapeutics, and Amgen Oncology. Some upcoming events in the myeloma community program that might interest you. On Thursday, January 28th at 11 a.m. Mountain, 1 p.m. Eastern, is our plasma cell leukemia support group launch. Plasma cell leukemia patients and caregivers are welcome to attend, as we are trying to find more data and collect and support just each other in the information that we have. Then on February the 2nd at 11 a.m. Mountain, 1 p.m. Eastern, we have our Myeloma Financial Coach chapter. Diana Valentine is our Myeloma Financial Coach, and she will be discussing estate planning. On Wednesday, February 3rd at 5 p.m. Mountain, 7 p.m. Eastern, we will host our Fitness for Myeloma chapter, where we will be doing yoga, specifically chair yoga. So if you aren't as mobile as you would like to be, or if you simply enjoy chair yoga, you're welcome to participate with us. You can sign up for any of those events by going to www.myelomacrowd.org/events.
Elise is asking a question too about when this Selinexor support group will take place.
The next Selinexor support group will be on the 24th of February at this same time, 11 a.m. Because you signed up for this event, you are now part of the Selinexor support group chapter, and you will receive a notification when that event has been created, and you are welcome to sign up for that event. It doesn't automatically enroll you in the event, but it does sign you up, or it does offer the ability for you to sign up for that event. Again, that is February 24th at 11 a.m. 11 a.m. Mountain, 1 p.m. Eastern. Thank you for attending this first meeting on Selinexor. We know that as you become your best advocate, you will obtain better care and outcomes. Thanks for being a part of this new Myeloma Crowd community, and we appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.